Thank you. I must admit, I was surprised to hear such a deep American accent.
Yeah.
Just made it easy to hear. I'm oral deaf. I found it interesting that it was the women who got together.
Yes.
From the different sectors, and I think there's something to learn from that. I think something needs to come out more. It's a very important action. You know, if the women can come together, and it means they came together on a centralising feature, something they had all in common with each other, and it's not just being women, their mothers, their sisters, their daughters, their aunties, their grandparents, their grandmothers, their granddaughters. That's very pivotal because it's something we can all relate to all around the world. And it's interesting that grandmothers are literate, but the granddaughters are illiterate. That's, again, isn't coming out strong enough, and it's something that is important for us to, more of us to be aware of, because that's such a tragedy, that is. Given in the 60s they were going forward. The question I would have is, and I suppose it's in some way picking up on the previous questioner, I'm a person who lives with disability and have all my life. I've come from 4 generations, and also means mental health. And the issue of women who have disabilities and mental health often gets renegated to not even being on the list. How does that feature with women that you deal with in the countries that you deal with?
It's definitely, I mean, oftentimes I try to work on the most vulnerable, which includes, you know, people with disabilities and includes young and also obviously women. So, you know, it's in terms of, and minorities. A lot of times in these countries, one of the big challenges is minorities as well. And one of the things that we've tried to do is unite them to form a block of their own, because often on their own they're not enough. So really, you know, making people aware of the other cause, which sometimes is difficult because everyone is coming from their particular perspective and think that they have it the worst off. They're the most vulnerable. And again, the donor community tends to feed that type of thinking as well, because they have to compete for funds, so they need to prove why they're the most vulnerable. And, you know, really trying to block that out and form some type of coalition. And to give you an example, with a lot of the issues that we dealt with women, is I often found that my greatest allies were male in the minority community. So, and just generally targeting men is a big part of my work. But, you know, I often found that to really start that conversation, for example, in Iraq, one of my greatest allies was the representative of the Christian minority inside Iraq. And I would go to him and say, you know, okay, you know how it feels to be a minority, although technically women aren't a minority, but still, you know, in terms of how they're treated, what do you advise? And really recruiting him. And I always call that women's rights defenders, understanding that needs to be men. Because often people try to put the entire burden on the female representatives who are in parliament, particularly for quotas introduced, and that's unfair to expect all that expectation of women. But to call it women's rights defenders opens it up to civil society, opens it up to government, opens it up again to private sector, but also, most importantly, opens it up to men and other groups who are marginalized. So, you know, a lot of times in Iraq you would find, you know, centered around human rights, organizations that are dedicated to the disability, particularly because of war in Afghanistan, because of landmines. These are really crucial issues. So, you know, kind of making sure that their rights are protected through the rule of law and building in common cause is important.
Well, this might be the right time to let a man ask a question. So.
Well, we've got one up the back here. There's one up the back here.
Okay, I'll come up this side in a second. Yeah.
My question goes to Iraq and to the period before 2003, about a dozen years, and I'm not the first person to have thought of this question, but its premise is that there can be no civil society without reconciliation, and there can be no reconciliation without forgiveness. And given that Western policy in the dozen years or so before 2003 is probably responsible for the deaths of more Iraqi children than anyone would care to count, do you have any suggestions on how we in the West can expect their mothers to forgive us?
It's, I think one of the most important thing is to support reconciliation inside as well as externally. And I think that the only way people will be able to really open up and forgive is when they see that the Western countries are now listening and taking the cues from what's inside. The Arab region, and anytime I travel overseas, as the previous person who asked the question pointed out, my accent automatically makes me the official representative of the US government. So it's very difficult I get asked, why is America doing this? Why won't Bush do that? Why is Obama doing this? And I have to, find some creative way to get myself out of the hot water of the questions that are asked. And oftentimes it is a little bit of, you did this to us. America did this to us. Why, how are you going to make amends? And I think that there is a very strong recognition of a difference between government and people in the Middle East. And I kind of wish in the Western countries we had the same type of approach, because we tend to lump everyone in together. So every Arab and every Muslim, and every Arab is a Muslim and every Muslim's an Arab, or whatever the stereotype of the media is, we tend to adopt. But in the regions throughout the countries, people differentiate between the population and between the government, and they recognize the solidarity. I met a woman today, I don't know where she is, who went to Iraq in solidarity to stop the war. Actually, she's right there. So, Iraqis remember the time of solidarity of Western countries in terms of sanctions and opposing sanctions. And in fact, most Western nations spoke out, citizens spoke out against sanctions more than neighboring countries. So, people all are aware, and they do recognize that. And the more, again, coming back to the microphone, the more we're heard as everyday global citizens, the more we will help our own governments make the right decisions and the right moves, hopefully, because we have the right to vote, and we should vote people out who don't listen to us.